Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this great attendance here. Delighted to welcome you here to lovely Merrion Square for this very important day for Liquid Gas Ireland. Just before I commence, a couple of housekeeping issues. In the likely event of an emergency, you can go out the front, or there's an emergency exit at the back under the stairs. There are also toilets under the stairs there as well. My name is Philip Hannon. I'm Policy Director here with Liquid Gas Ireland. And it's my pleasure to act as your chair here this morning. To commence, I want to thank the many guests who have travelled from abroad here to be with us today. In particular, SV Group Head Esther Boucher, who is also President of Liquid Gas Europe. And it's fantastic to have that organisation represented here. She's also joined by her colleague, Leo Wassner from Liquid Gas Europe. I also wish to acknowledge the presence of Liquid Gas UK Director Richard Hakim. And Richard, I only met you last week at another event, so you must love Dublin. So I wonder, have you gone home at all? But it's great for us to have the support and endorsement of our fellow organisations in the liquid gas family throughout Europe. Before commencing my short presentation, which will be mercifully short before we get on to the main part of the event, I'd like to thank my colleagues at Liquid Gas Ireland for the central role they have played in bringing us to where we are today. These are Paul O'Connell, our Chair, Liam Doyle, our Company Secretary, Catherine Hannon of Caller, and Owen O'Flynn of Flowgas, who are the company representatives. Their commitment to this project has been tireless. I also want to thank the Instinctive Partners team, David and his team in particular, who have been brilliant in doing all the logistics for this and supporting us. The launch of liquid gas, making the just transition more sustainable for rural Ireland, is a major policy statement by Liquid Gas Ireland. You all have copies of the document, which sets out in detail our proposals on a mixed technology approach for the energy needs of rural Ireland at a time of climate change. I'm going to take you through the main elements of the document, and at the end of that, we're going to hear from a number of consumers on how this just transition to LPG and bio-LPG is impacted on their lives. So before doing that, I just want to take you through the agenda of what we'll do. We'll be here for about an hour, I would imagine. We'll start with my presentation, then we'll have the consumer videos, then we're moving to a panel discussion, and then we're going to have an audience Q&A. So just to commence, I've condensed the document very much down to what we see as the key points in it and the key messages we're trying to get across and what we mean by a just transition. And by a just transition, we mean a move away from high carbon fossil fuels, one that should be accessible, affordable and fair options to all homes and businesses. By a just transition, we mean that rural dwellings have the same variety of choices to decarbonise as those in urban settings, because we believe they don't at the moment. Current policy does not address the unique economic and infrastructural challenges facing Ireland in achieving this just transition. We strongly believe the current one-size-fits-all approach, and reiterated recently in the updated Climate Action Plan that focuses primarily on heat pumps, it's straitjacking the options that are available to rural dwellers as they move to decarbonise. For many rural homeowners, the installation of an effective heat pump is simply too expensive an option, even with the available grants. What we're showing in this document is that a switch to renewable-ready gas boiler is an effective and fairer way to move rural homes and businesses away from oil and solid fuels to lower carbon options. Not only is this cheaper to install, it'll also improve energy efficiency and air quality. So those are the main points from our document. Now, at the very heart of our document is an actual study that we've commissioned that I think some of you will find interesting. We certainly did. We looked at a typical rural home built in between the 60s and 70s in Ireland with a very low carbon emission rating, a D1 rating, in fact, quite inefficient. And we examined it in detail, and by replacing the oil boiler with a renewable-ready gas boiler coupled with fabric upgrades such as wall insulation, attic insulation and solar panels, you can actually lift the BER rating from D1 to B1. which is about just as good as you could do with a heat pump, but much more cost effective. And the upfront cost we've calculated for that is about just over 11,000 euros, which I think is very competitive compared to heat pumps. So we can show that you can actually do this, both upfront costs and lowering emissions very significantly. So the key research findings that we got from this, really, just to sum up what I've said, is renewable ready gas boilers should be considered as a key decarbonisation solution for home heating. They provide a realistic alternative for oil boiler replacement, allowing homes in rural Ireland, both on and off the grid, a step-by-step just transition to decarbonisation. Our research demonstrates there are alternative scenarios in which inefficient properties using oil-fired boiler for home heating can be upgraded to increase its BER to a B1. And by alternatives, we mean obviously alternatives to heat pumps. We don't mean replacing them, we mean alongside them, giving people a choice. So it is possible to meet a B1 rating by installing a renewable ready gas boiler with a standard building fabric and energy upgrades for the home. And to conclude my element of the presentation, just the key recommendations we have at the back of the document. Obviously, number one, we're asking the government to look at supporting these renewable ready gas boilers for this uplift we've demonstrated. We also think that the state needs to integrate LPG, bio-LPG and RDME, which, if you like, is the future of renewable liquid gas, into current and future government policy to ensure that this mixed technology approach is available to businesses and homes off the natural gas grid in particular. We also want a better regulatory environment which supports the use and availability of renewable liquid gases to meet the energy needs of Ireland. And other ones, we think there is great potential for more R&D in the development of feedstocks and HVO production in Ireland. We think there is great potential there for that. And of course, look at exploring, can Ireland in time produce RDME here? Which, as I say, is very much the future. So that's a very quick spin through the document. It's all set out in detail there. And what I want to do now is just let you hear the voice of two consumers and the difference the switch is making to them.
Liam Sheedy here, former Tipperary hurling manager and current Sunday game analyst. I heard about LPG through my local area representative, who was very, very helpful throughout the whole process. He came out and visited the house, had a look at my previous oil system, which was old and outdated, and answered any questions we had and made the whole changeover from oil to LPG seamless. Most recently, we have made a switch from LPG to bio-LPG. The current climate crisis was a large factor in ensuring that we made the switch to bio-LPG. Bio-LPG offers up to 90% carbon emissions reductions. The switch over from oil to bio-LPG could not have been easier. The local RGI installer came out, visited the house, answered any questions we had, and it was actually completed all in one day. It was a seamless transition from oil to bio-LPG, and there was absolutely no disruption to our normal day-to-day lives. Since we have made a switch from oil to bio-LPG, we simply haven't looked back. It was an extremely efficient process, and we were delighted to have all of the benefits that come with having installed bio-LPG. The on-demand heating system makes our home warm instantly. We also benefit from on-demand hot water, which is really important when you're trying to look after a full family. Bio-LPG is an affordable, convenient and drop-in solution to decarbonisation. This is an easy solution for any household to contribute to local air quality. My family are very happy that we made the switch from oil to bio-LPG.
Any Tipperary hurling fans here? Okay, well Barry, you'll be happy to hear now for the Offaly angle. This is our second case study.
We bought the house about 3 years ago and we had an old oil boiler. And the previous house we had piped gas, so it seemed a lot cleaner and a lot more efficient. So we were looking at our options for here and we heard about LPG. So we looked into that and we went with that.
Believe it or not, we heard about LPG first just on a radio. I was in the car one day and an ad came on the radio with the offer that was there in terms of the service, and it spoke about the efficiencies of LPG, and there's a couple of other incentives then too in terms of, you know, boilers, and there was a bit of a reduction in the installation costs as well. So we heard about it on the radio and took it from there. The process of switching from oil to LPG was extremely simple. I just went on online, logged a query about it, got a call a few days later, and within about a month, maybe 6 weeks, we had our tank installed, boiler installed, and we were operating on LPG.
The main benefit I'd see is that it's instant heat. As soon as we turn it on, the place is warm in minutes. It's a lot more efficient, and we can turn it on the app on the phone out of the house that we certainly couldn't do with the oil before.
Yeah, making the switch from oil to LPG, it has definitely had a lot of benefits for our own family life here. I think the speed at which the house heats, the speed at which the hot water is heated up is fantastic. And you're not waiting around then for showers after mucky rugby sessions or mucky football matches. So that's all, time is great to have that bit of time back. Also, kind of the control that we have on the stock management, it's monitored remotely. If the stock drops below a certain level, we know the truck is coming to top up the tank outside. So you're not trying to coordinate, time off work or whatever else to be the house waiting for an oil truck to come.
Yeah, in relation to security, I suppose, it would have been part of the decision that oil can be easily stolen and the prices are only rising, so it would be a risk. The gas is definitely the safer option, and it's not going to be stolen, so we know we have it.
It was a huge part of it really, when we looked at alternative fuel sources from the oil that was in the house when we first bought it, and being in an area that was heavily dependent on solid fossil fuels over the years, we absolutely looked at a solution that would deliver in terms of environmental and sustainability and indeed climate action. So LPG when we looked at that option first, we knew it was a cleaner fuel, haven't had experience with gas before, but also the option that's available to us in either blending in some bio-LPG, which is fully renewable, or indeed burning bio-LPG only was certainly very enticing for us. So we wanted to have that option for our household.
Yeah, the air quality, I suppose, in an urban rural town, and especially in the Midlands, solid fuel, fossil fuel fires and smoke would definitely be very obvious if you were out running or walking or anything, especially in the evenings in the winter. For us to have a better, cleaner heating system that gave a cleaner air was definitely part of our decision. And then having the young kids, I suppose you want to try and do your bit for cleaner air for them, and looking at climate change and all that for the future.
So there you have it, the voice of consumers. Those two case studies are set out in the document, as are another two customer experience. So now on to the substantive part of the morning. Our panel, on our panel here, moderating it is Stella Meehan, editor of Agriland. Agriland is a leading online portal for all things agricultural and rural. And it's going from strength to strength, I believe. Stella tells me that they're now getting up to 60,000 unique users every day. So it's the go-to place for information on agricultural issues and on rural affairs. And I know that they have a particular interest in this mixed technology area. So we're delighted to have Stella here moderating. Next to Stella is Dr. Mira Lynch of the ESRI. She is a senior researcher there. She's established herself very much as a respected commentator on climate action and environmental issues, and we're delighted to have her here to give her independent analysis into this debate. So thank you very much, Miriam. Next to her is Duncan Osborne, who is CEO of Calar Ireland, and next to him is John Rooney, Managing Director of Flowgas Ireland, our two main member companies, and they'll be putting the consumer perspective in particular. And last but not least is Deputy Barry Cowan, Teachtadála for Laois Offaly for Fianna Fáil, and a long advocate of social inclusion and rural development in Ireland. So I'll hand over to you now, Stella. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. You're all very welcome here this morning, and thanks to our panellists for taking part there. Philip gave a very succinct, I suppose, summation of the future for LG Ireland and for LPG and bio-LPG. Dr. Mira Lynch from the ESRI, I might go to you first and ask you about what was mentioned in the presentation, and indeed it's in the booklets there, in relation to mixed technology. Is this mixed technology approach, I suppose, would it be adequate? Would it be appropriate? in, I suppose, our drive to meet our decarbonisation targets across the country?
Yeah, so I suppose I'd make a number of points. Kind of from a pure economic point of view, what we tend to say is just price all the externalities and then let it all come out in the wash. So that would be a completely technology neutral approach. And so long as you have your carbon priced appropriately and you have your air quality priced appropriately, then you just let everyone do whatever they need to do and our targets will kind of naturally be met. However, there's been kind of great advances in behavioural economics in particular that's kind of making us re-question that a bit. And this is not to say that we don't need carbon taxes, we do, but it's more that there are other barriers, non-financial barriers, that maybe aren't being taken into account. So the financial barriers were mentioned in the presentation, but what about behavioural barriers? There's the hassle of leaving your house and having to move out for however many months in order to get the whole thing retrofitted. I haven't seen any research that internalises that. And then another barrier that I would talk about would be the fact that what the research seems to be telling us now is that energy efficiency upgrades seem to be kind of sunk into increased thermal comfort. So when we kind of do the engineering calculation of, well, if you go from an E rating to a B1 rating, you're going to save this much carbon, that kind of assumes that you were running your boiler or whatever heating source at whatever level it needed to be in order to have your E rating house at a comfortable temperature. What we're learning now is actually people are underheating their homes, so that when they get that energy efficiency upgrade, it's great for their health, it's great for their comfort levels, but we're not necessarily getting the carbon savings that we would want. So some nuggets from the behavioural research that I would leave us with today. First of all, interestingly, there is no urban-rural gap when it comes to support for climate action. So it was very interesting to me that both of the sets of consumers mentioned environmental and climate concerns as being the primary driver in one case and one of the drivers in the other case for making the switch to LPG or bio-LPG. And that reflects what we're seeing in the data. So this idea that there is this is a Dublin policy being forced on the rest of the country is simply not true. There is strong support for climate action across the country and there's no urban-rural gap there. But what I would say is that the behavioural research has not actually been done in order to determine what is the best way to decarbonise, considering what the consumer does. So I think it's very telling that we have, of all of our energy targets, we've missed them all, let's face it, but the one that we missed by the least was our renewable electricity target. Because the consumer doesn't have to do anything in particular there. They continue to use electricity as they always did, and we decarbonised the fuel. And I'm increasingly wondering whether we need to take that same approach for heating and transport, where the consumer makes minimal change in terms of what they invest in and what they do day to day, but behind the scenes we actually decarbonise the fuel. Now the flip side to that is, of course, we have to pay to decarbonise the fuel. We need to work that out. But I think that would be a very fruitful avenue for research which would complement the research that's already been done here, not just looking at the finances but also looking at the behavioural response.
You mentioned there that there is no urban-rural gap between the behaviours of people having, I suppose, the
attitudes.
The attitude, to want to decarbonise, to want to reduce emissions. Mm-hmm. But in terms of national policy, is it too narrow? People would argue that there is a gap in national policy in terms of rural and urban, because many rural areas do not have the option of connecting to the national grid, and they have no other options, or so far they have no other options, certainly none that government policy is promoting that are within their economic range. And do you feel, or can you tell if the policy is too narrow coming nationally on energy for rural areas?
So what I would say is the policy is certainly too narrow in one respect, in that even if we hit every single target, we're still going to miss the climate targets because we have some kind of unrealised savings in there under the climate action plan. So we have to do absolutely everything we're saying we're going to do and more in order to do what we need to do. So straight away there's a gap there that these kind of technologies could potentially fill. Now, policy is aware of that gap in terms of getting to the final carbon targets, and it's basically saying this is a we don't know area, and this is somewhere where we're trying to do a bit of research to fill in the we don't know. In terms of the policy supports though, I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a kind of an urban-rural gap in terms of ability to use a heat pump or ability to invest in a heat pump. Certainly there's an income gap, but it doesn't break as cleanly on urban-rural as you think. There are very deprived areas in urban settings as well. So I would say it's more of a technology-specific focus that tends to be driven by the pure economics of getting that kilowatt hour of heat. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but the problem is if we forget about all of the other economic and all of the other financial and social costs and purely focus on what's the cheapest way to get a kilowatt hour of heat, and let's focus policy on that, then you may actually wind up with a suboptimal solution in the long run. Whereas if you had taken all of the constraints into account, including constraints on the construction sector, including constraints in terms of the transport options that rural households face, then you might actually arrive at a different solution, which is more achievable.
Duncan, I might go to you next as General Manager of CALR. Muireann mentioned there, I suppose, about options. And options are perhaps limited for people who cannot connect to the national grid. When we talk about a just transition, or LGI talks about a just transition in terms of allowing choice for consumers, particularly in rural areas, does this offer them an option?
I think there are options for them. It's just finding out, sort of getting them into people's heads of what they can and can't do. At the moment, they're being given one option, when actually there are a number of steps to take between sort of, an F-rated home and an A-rated home. There are a number of movements they can make, and actually they don't have to go just to the end game. And that's what I think people are struggling with at the moment, is which choice should I make and in what order? So should I go with should I go with this step, should I go with that? And so they're feeling a bit trapped at the moment. So whilst there are options, they're not understanding necessarily which route to take and how to take them. And that is what we're hearing from a lot of people is, and I think you're right, they want to make the move, they don't know what to do, and they just see one journey which is a bit too far. And that's their struggle at the moment. So what we're trying to offer them is different routes, different options, but not as substantive of actually, completely retrofitting and taking apart the home and starting again. They can do this in steps. So that's what we hear a lot from the customers is help us in this stepwise. We want to get to this point, but we can't get there in one move. So can we do that? And can we as an industry help them in this journey? And that's what we hear a lot from our customers.
So do you feel then as an LGI member that LPG or bio-LPG is what will offer that just transition, as it's called?
I think it is one of the big steps they can do, because it is part of what they know and how they are, and they can do that along the route. And if they are looking then at renewable ready gas boilers, they feel that then, okay, they take this step and there are more steps to take down that journey. Whereas at the moment there is just this one move and it is quite hard, but we can take those journeys which get to the same destination but over a period of time. Because the challenge for us is a lot of customers are doing nothing because they don't know what to do, so they get stuck. And therefore they wait and they wait and they wait and nothing happens. And that feels a bit, why we're struggling to meet the targets is a lot of people just paralyzed by what to do. And what we're trying to offer here is more routes to the same destination in a transition effect. So that's where we as LPG and bio-LPG and RDME in the future can offer people different alternatives that allow them to go down this journey to ultimately decarbonise.
Deputy Barry Cowan, you're an advocate of social inclusion, just transition. You're a TD in Laois Offaly. What's being suggested here today, LPG and bio-LPG or mixed technology, do you think that's a viable option for many parts of rural Ireland as a way of securing just transition?
It's probably and possibly the only option for many households. But I think there's two strands you have to be conscious of here. In the rush for the state to electrify transport, to electrify heat, it has to have the capacities and the energy security to be in a position for people to take advantage of that. And I know people will immediately point to the fact that 40% of energy generated is now done by renewables, which is true, but predominantly the dominant aspect of that delivery is from wind, land-based wind generation. Now, unfortunately, we haven't had the parallel to that, the provision, for example, of battery storage alongside that development, because when the wind blows excessively, we're not capturing the generation that could be captured as a result of that. And when the wind doesn't blow, we have an issue whereby the old reliables kick onto the grid's line, and the cost of maintaining those old reliable power plants is quite excessive, which means a bigger spend on the part of households. So that's something that we have to catch up on, and there's an onus of responsibility on the state to do that. Then you have the situation whereby people have to see, with that in mind, how can they contribute towards reduction of emissions. And as has been said, while we would love and to be in a position to go directly to A-rated status with our homes tomorrow. Many people, as I said, and you alluded to, cannot afford that. But they want to make a contribution, and not only to reduction in emissions, but obviously they want to see a means by which the costs associated with generating heat in their home can be reduced. And that might initially be simply an insulation grant, which is provided under the SEI grants presently. That can reduce costs by up to 25% in a year. Thereafter, they can amend and alter an existing boiler, whether it be for HVO in relation to oil or biogas in relation to what's been promoted here today. And both can reduce emissions over a 10-year period by 85 to 90%. And that's a huge contribution that otherwise wouldn't be made unless provision and a commitment is made to allow and cater for that. But as against that, then you have some politicians, unfortunately, that go out and say that we're going to ban, gas boilers and oil boilers in 2024 or from 2024, instead of qualifying that by saying over a further 20-year period, they will be eradicated. So in order to make a contribution in the meantime, here's an opportunity to transition. And that's what the consumers are doing, and the state then must be up in the game in relation to the manner in which they can address energy security. And the greatest potential that exists there is offshore. The greatest potential there is to generate up to 300 billion of an income for this state by 2050, which is the size of the economy today. And we can become a net exporter of energy. And we can be at the start of a pipe rather than at the end of one, which we are presently, and all of which has been exposed by virtue of the war in Ukraine and the pressure on energy security. But there was a pressure on our energy security prior to the war at all, and many would say the wholesale energy market and electricity market was one which had too much of an overdependence on old fossil fuel plants, which in turn, as I said, because of the cost associated with their maintenance, because of the lack of alternatives, when the wind wasn't blowing, meant there was very high prices being paid by consumers anyway. So, I was a party to the government formation talks. I was a party to the programme for government negotiations and the agreement that was reached between the parties thereafter. I was a party to the decision from a political perspective to ensure that the revenue from carbon tax was ring-fenced and was available to consumers to provide options. Those options, as far as I'm concerned, and for the party that I represent, most definitely includes the options that are provided by the likes of biogas, by the likes of HVO, and the numbers within government would seek for me to determine that will become an option, but it has to be included after a review of the SEI grants to allow people, as has been said, insulation grants. They can air tighten their windows and doors thereafter. They can alter their oil burners or put in a gas burner. They can make a contribution. And over time, if they want then to electrify their heat, by all means, but only by bringing them with you rather than browbeating them, which they can't afford anyway.
Well, you mentioned there you were a party to the formation of the government. You're a Fianna Fáil TD. LGI might argue that the policy of government in terms of energy and decarbonisation in this country is too narrow. It's a one-size-fits-all with, perhaps various parties in government promoting very much a heat pump or be it SAI. There are other options, of course. Does it not seem like a simple own goal to offer a broader view in terms of LPG? Bio-LPG is not subject to the carbon tax as far as I'm aware. LPG, doesn't have the security and isn't as strongly affected by geopolitical tensions as LNG, for example, and they are very separate. That's another plus, one would say. It offers people in rural areas who just need to get renewable gas boilers installed rather than having a deep retrofit where they have to leave their homes. And if everyone in this country, I feel, understands the climate challenges we're facing and people are orientated towards wanting to reduce their own emissions. But if someone in a rural area, be it Kerry, be it Laois Offaly, be it West Mayo, wants to try and decarbonise their own home and they're getting a quote for a heat pump and other installation upgrade of €60,000 versus what the likes of the members of LGI can offer, which is €11,000 to really transform your BER rating. Why isn't the government promoting that?
Well, I would say the first phase of that was provided for by virtue of the government grant system in relation to an installation grant initially, which was a new addition, and up to 90% of the cost associated with that, up to about, I think the most you'll pay for that type of wall and attic installation is about €4,000. My contention, my belief, my argument within government thereafter is that we review the system as was provided for in the last year and look at the statistics, which will prove the very point that you're making, that there is an opening for a graded system, a graded grant aid that can help and assist households to do that transition over time, which would include, having gone maybe towards a 90% contribution towards a 4,000 expenditure, that a similar percentage grant aid would be available to households on a spend of 10 or 11,000, as is provided for in the transition of this nature that's been discussed today. And that's the point I've made within our own party, and many of my colleagues have, who agree with what's been proposed here today, who acknowledge it is a means to an end, and who can use our influence within government to ensure, having had the first review of the grant system that's there presently in relation to retrofitting, that this option now becomes a reality going forward.
John Rooney of Flowgas, I'll go to you. What your company, among other companies, are at the coalface. They know what consumers are asking, what consumers are looking for, and essentially what consumers can afford. Is LGI a way of helping these consumers with their just transition to, I suppose, a more environmentally friendly way of heating their homes, of cooking, of using transport?
Yeah, it is, and as my colleagues here, I think a word that's been used a few times has been capacity. So there's different aspects. There's the capacity of the construction sector, for example, to be able to retrofit so many homes when they're also trying to build 30,000 plus homes each year. There's the capacity of the grid, the electricity grid, to cope with such a massive increase in electricity demand if everybody retrofitted. And then there's just the capacity or affordability of the consumer to be able to retrofit, whether it's financial capacity to pay for it, or the capacity to leave their house for 6 or 8 weeks while it's been done. So I think that the danger is, if there's lack of capacity in all those assets, the default go-to place is almost just to do nothing. And I think that's the real danger. And I think, all of us together, the industry, government, all of the stakeholders, we're in danger of just walking into a kind of a do-nothing scenario and just kind of hope it just goes away. Whereas what Liquid Gas Ireland are offering today, and have been for the last couple of years, is a transition. It's a journey. It starts with your oil boiler or your solid fuel heating system or whatever the case is. But I think Liam Sheedy just put it up really well there. He talked about, first of all, he moved to LPG. And then a year or two later, he discovered there's bio-LPG. And he thought, okay, do you know what? I've already cut my emissions by, 12 or 13% by going just to regular LPG. And then he reduced them further, 80, 90%. And look, I don't know where he'll be in 10 years' time, but he could be in a new house, he might be on something else. But he recognised there was a transition, it was done in a day. Okay, the decision-making process might have taken a little bit longer by having an installer just check his house and order a boiler on his behalf. So I think that's what Liquid Gas Ireland are offering. It's just this seamless transition that will prevent people doing nothing. Because I think if the whole country do nothing, which is in danger of walking into, then we as a nation will not make the progress we need to.
And John, it's obviously something that can go into areas that other heating solutions cannot go, that are not connected to the national grid. And if people wanted to start with LPG, it's not a case that they have to automatically then go to bio-LPG. You can do that mixed blend.
Yeah, you can. I mean, you can start with a blend of LPG. You can say, I'll go 20%, 40%, and then eventually transition towards 100% pure bio-LPG over a period of time. It's a drop-in fuel, so you can blend the percentage of bio with regular LPG. And of course, you can then further down the track, we'll be introducing RDME as well. That's well in development. I think the thing about rural is, the grid. It's almost like two types of people in this world. You're either on grid or off grid, and the on grid families and houses are well catered for. The grid passes by, and they can make a little connection. Or most of them have already connected, and they have already made the first stage of their transition. And I think on-grid, they'll be moving towards biomethane, etc. It's off-grid, where there hasn't really been those options or incentives. And now, just as it's starting to gather pace, where households and families realise actually there is an option, it's called LPG, and it's first stage of moving on to bio-LPG. Just as the awareness of that and the interest in that is coming along, there's now a risk of it perhaps being taken away, because if you look at the most recent policy document banning gas boilers, I mean, that's no help to anybody.
Maureen, I might go back to you again. You mentioned targets and pretty much said we might as well put our hands up, we're not going to meet them, you know. There's retrofit targets.
Don't quote me on that.
There's retrofit targets, obviously, in this country, and the government wants to retrofit 500,000 houses. Mm-hmm. And judging by their deadline, that's looking at over 62,000 odd a year to retrofit. And on last checking, now this was last checking by Agriland, but there wasn't even 1,000 a year being retrofitted. I mean, to anyone, those maths don't add up. So I suppose from a policy point of view and from a government point of view, are setting targets like this, are they nearly too ambitious and not practical or implementable?
Good Lord. I mean, there are two schools of thought, right? And this is getting outside of my field now. I'm not a political economist, but I mean, there's the school of thought that if you don't set a target, like by setting a target, you signal that you're committed to this, you're going to put money behind it, you'll get more investment. Without a target, nothing will happen. And the other school of thought is a target is an easy thing to do politically. You can show, look, we've set a target for X, Y, Z. You don't actually have to put any kind of supporting policies in place. And then as time goes on, you just kind of don't meet the targets, but no one really cares because you moved on to a new target. Of course, what that means is that the more targets you miss, the less valuable your targets become, because every time you miss a target, you're undermining your own credibility. So those would be, that's my understanding of the two schools of thought, and I couldn't possibly say what the optimal course of action is. But what I would say is that one thing that I would love to see taken into account is the capacity of the construction sector to actually retrofit these homes, because we're also trying to build a record number of homes per year because we also have a housing crisis. And I have yet to see a piece of analysis that takes that into account, that says, is this, just in terms of forgetting about finances, even if we had all the money in the world, do we have the actual capacity in the construction sector to meet our housing and our retrofitting targets? And that's something that we certainly need to look at. Another thing is as well, both of these targets are super short term. I mean, if we had 100 years, we'd slowly retrofit the entire building stock, put in heat pumps everywhere, and we'd be fine. We don't have 100 years. We have, we're finding it extremely difficult to recruit at the moment because the people we offer jobs to cannot find somewhere to live. It's not even that they cannot find somewhere they can afford to live, they cannot find somewhere to live at all. So the housing crisis is particularly acute, and the climate crisis is also particularly acute. We have to do this now. And in that context, I would say, for whatever reason, and it really mystifies me as to why, for whatever reason in Ireland, we're absolutely mad for taking options off the table. So we just ban things right, left and centre. And again, I wonder, is that because that's something that's a little bit easier to do politically? Saying, well, we'll ban all the bad stuff, but without putting in place some supporting and enabling policies to achieve the good stuff, then you just wind up in a rut. So I hope I've sufficiently skirted around your actual question and given you something.
Yeah, you have. Thank you. Duncan, going back to the consumer again, I suppose. I'm a consumer. I live in rural Ireland. I cannot connect to the national grid. Mm-hmm. I have oil and bottled gas, a combination. Yeah. I'm being told by 2030 I've got 7 years left, I need to have a heat pump in. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anyone knows we're in a cost of living crisis at the moment. I do not have money for a heat pump. What are my options? Can I get my house, probably be C rating house, up to a better BER rating with a renewable gas boiler and some maybe alterations to the house in terms of insulation and windows?
Definitely. I mean, this is one of the things we see is that you can get 80% of the way there for 20% of the cost by looking at a boiler, by looking at a couple of measures, and similar to the case study we looked at, for a few simple measures, for around about 10,000 euros rather than 50 or 60,000, you could get all the way up into a B rating. Yes, there's still further you can go, but that gives you time to move one big step. And that's what we're really trying to promote, is that there are many steps, and depending on the house will depend on which particular steps you take. But a renewable gas-ready boiler is one of those where efficiently in there with controls you can get along the big first step. Add to that then insulation, add to that a few other measures, and you start this journey. And then over time, things come into play, and you can then look at the next step and the next step and the next step. But this, Councilman John and others have mentioned that you do nothing because we don't know what to do, so we stay where we are, doesn't help the country on the journey. So we just get further and further away, and the target's bigger and bigger. So for me, it's absolutely possible with these steps, in the first step, to take that first measure, then the next measure, then the next, and to understand, okay, what the route. And that's what we're trying to explain to people, is there are many ways to skin this cat and there are many routes up this mountain. The journey is still the same, but you can start moving now, rather than having to wait for the huge step that is becoming just unaffordable for everybody in that way.
John, could I get a renewable gas boiler installed and then perhaps move to a heat pump down the road? Or could they, work in tandem? Or could I get essentially the boiler put in now without having to move out of the house, having to have a major retrofit, get my BER rating up, and that equate to a just transition?
Yes, you could. You just taking your house and Claremont to begin with. You're already using gas probably for cooking or a fire or whatever. So you just move to maybe what we call a bulk LPG tank, and then perhaps the next stage would be to get a percentage of bio-LPG. You could go 20, 50 or 100% depending on what you choose. And then further down the track, if you decide, it could be 5, 6, 8, 10 years when perhaps the situation has improved either economically for us all, or capacity again to be able to retrofit, or the technology has improved again where you could get a heat pump. And that might perhaps in all likelihood then replace your renewable gas boiler, and you will then be full heat pump. And you might still like to retain the fire, because people do like a gas fire, but it would be perhaps serviced through a cylinder at the back. Or people like to cook on gas, and you could still retain that. So you could have, in 10 years' time, a heat pump and back to your cylinder again. So that's the thing about LPG. It's just so flexible. It comes in a bottle format for barbecues or for gas fires, gas cookers, even indoors, or it comes in bulk format for heating and hot water.
And what about RDME? Now, I'll use the acronym.
Yeah.
You can say the full name. But LPG, bio-LPG and RDME. What are the long-term prospects for RDME in this country?
Well, RDME is a renewable dimethyl ether. It's another form of a liquid gas, and of course we are a liquid gas association, so we are always looking at ways to bring new technologies into the market to ensure that we have capacity to meet the demand. So it is, while bio-LPG has been in development and has been coming on stream over the last probably about 5 years, RDME is just starting to come on stream now. I think we'll start to see the beginnings of it coming into the country later this year. I think the challenge will be for us to be able to produce it ourselves. So therefore I would certainly encourage the government to look at ways of maybe investing in research and development so that can be developed locally here in Ireland. We have plenty of feedstock in terms of we're an agri-based economy. We've everything from food waste to slurry, whatever. So there are lots of ways of developing RDME and bio-LPG here in Ireland. So that's probably the next challenge that we have. Barry
Cowan, is the political will there to, I suppose, broaden the horizons of policy and maybe include options such as LGI is suggesting today in terms of a just transition to decarbonising our society, our economy, our country?
It most definitely is. The means and manners by which you get there and by which you bring people with you is what will determine whether it's successful or not. I don't doubt the goodwill, the bona fides, the good intentions of the likes of Eamon Ryan and his party. But I do doubt his version of reality, insofar as there's no way or means by which the present provisions will get us to where we want in relation to emissions or transition. And that's the reason why I believe it's incumbent on me and my colleagues within government and opposition to ensure that those options will now be part of the next measure of suite of measures to help and assist the state and households to move in that direction. I was talking to Michael McGrath yesterday, with some people in relation to the NTMA recently put out a call for green bonds. They attracted 3 billion of investment, but it was oversubscribed there was 30 billion of requests. So that shows you the research, development and intent from the investment market is there to play to ensure that Ireland realises the ambition it has, but it has to get its ducks in a row to ensure that that is the case. You know, we will see this week the publication of the Planning and Development Amendment Act, which will seek to address the whole area of planning and the log jams and blockages that are in the present planning system, not only in relation to residential development, but commercial development and infrastructural development. And it's imperative that the new Marine Board that's put in place to accommodate the transition and the provision of offshore wind is given the sort of powers that can ensure that those decisions are made quickly and that the development comes quickly thereafter, rather than this contention or belief that we're 10 years away from it. You know, with all due respect to the likes of the Dockland Authority, and it might have turned sour eventually, but I mean, there was the thinking behind it when it was set up by Charlie Haughey many years ago was to ensure it did what it was set out to do in a timely fashion. And we wouldn't have seen the development of the Docklands and the Financial Services Centre being done in a manner in which it was and how quickly it came to fruition, because it put in place the sort of expertise that was necessary to ensure that that development took place, and it took place quickly. And the same impetus, the same effort and the same commitment has to be given in relation to the prospects and the potential we have to realise our ambition in relation to our emissions and the benefits that can accrue to this country economically by virtue of the marvellous opportunities that exist offshore.
Maureen mentioned there about capacity. It's a very valid and interesting point about the capacity to retrofit and the capacity to build new housing. We have obligations for both. Is policy there supporting, the likes of the Construction Industry Federation to try and meet the targets? Or is policy contradictory? We need to build this many new homes and provide this much housing, but then we want 500,000 houses retrofitted as well. And if anyone has rang a plumber or an engineer in the last 6 months and tried to get them within the space of 13 months, good luck to them.
Look, there are obvious challenges that you can't deny, and you have to work with the educational system, with the third level system in relation to apprenticeships, for example, to ensure that there's progress made in this regard. Despite everything, 28,000 startups, housing starts were completed last year. That's the highest in many years. In my own constituency as well, CIF are working with local education providers to put in place retrofitting programs for apprenticeships, which is thankfully oversubscribed this year, having only been set up last year. So there is a recognition on the part of the industry of it needing to be in a position to meet the demand that could be realised, and that is being realised in many cases. It'll be even greater when we talk about those suite of measures are more realistic or more in tune with the options that the industry is providing, rather than the aspirations there might be of one member of the Cabinet.
Duncan, from an industry perspective, yourself and John, obviously big members of LGI. What would you encourage the government to do to support you and companies such as yourselves to provide these options to offer a just transition, particularly in areas that are not connected to the national grid?
I think the couple of things we would like really is that they recognise that this has a role to play. This movement in terms of off-grid gas has a position within the transition. That is seen as being something where we can move people into a step and they can carry on. So they move away from solid fuel or oil heating into gas and then onwards to other measures. So that is recognised within the route and the just transition. The second thing we're looking for is support to develop further the renewable gas options. We see the bio-LPG is coming, RDME is coming, but it needs help in terms of really supporting those first steps to allow people who are off the natural gas grid to have those options for the future as quickly as possible. So those are the two things we're really looking for. There's a recognition of the LPG currently, and then the support for the renewable gases as they come to the market.
Maureen, what influences behaviour? If people living in rural areas are still working off solid fuel or oil, LPG, bio-LPG, a lot of people may not even know what they are yet. They may even confuse them with LNG. what influences people's behaviour? Is it a government pushing policy that puts awareness on it? Is it from a more altruistic way and wanting to decarbonise themselves? What kind of things influence their behaviours?
It's a very big question. I suppose without the information, you're on a kind of, it's a non-starter. However, information provision on its own is very, very weak at influencing behaviour. Now, one of my hobby horses is there's this idea that we can cure every single social ill via informational programs, possibly in schools. So, you know, climate is in there, but also healthy eating, road safety, sexual health, all of these things. And if we just kind of pause for a second, we're saying, we could fix all of these problems if only we sat down and told teenagers to make better life choices. I think we kind of realise how ridiculous it actually is. And yet, for some reason, we can't get away from this idea that we just need to have an informational campaign, or we just need to run a national radio campaign, or whatever. So what we do actually see in the data is habit formation is really hard to break. So one of the good things to do is when you're already making a big change, so you're already kind of putting in new structures, new habits, that can be a really good time to make a transition, whether it's an investment. So think of the times when you made a big change in your life. So something like when you got married, when you bought your home, if you had kids, when you switched jobs, if you have a bereavement. These are times when there's a big change going on already. And that can actually counterintuitively to some ways be the best time to encourage a further change. And when you think about all those examples I just gave you, you pretty much have to officially inform the state that each of those has happened. So could it be that we can harness the fact that, for example, we know you're moving house, we have a specific grant for upgrading your heating system when you move. So that means that you just kind of push out the move-in date a little bit. So you get rid of the hassle factor of having to move out of your house and then move back into your house after you've done the retrofit. That would be one option. Another option I heard of is every time you move house, you get access to free public transport in the area for the first 6 weeks. I think that's a great idea, because if you have and then same if you change jobs, so you've got a new job and you're like, how am I going to get to my new job? Am I going to work from home? Am I going to drive, or am I going to take public transport? Well, if you had free public transport, then you might spend a few weeks figuring out the best route, and then from then on you might continue to take public transport. So we're getting off topic a bit, but I suppose the way to influence behaviour it's not just a case of we just need to give everybody the information and we need to pay everybody enough money and it'll just happen. If anything, our track record on climate to date has shown that that is not true. We need to actually tap into how people actually behave when they're able to take information on board and when they're able to make changes, and see how can we exploit what we already know about people's lifestyles in order to enable them and encourage them to make those switches.
John Rooney, LGI, this document here today, it's very straightforward. It outlines the emissions reductions that you can get, particularly from bio-LPG, but also from LPG. It outlines how simple it is to get a renewable gas boiler installed, more or less just substitute it in for if you have an existing boiler, and so on. It seems so simple. So what are the challenges?
Yeah, and I mean, your question to Mervyn was, it's around behaviours. So how can we change people's behaviours? I think there's two things. One is awareness. So, we as an industry, but also the government, need to drive awareness of this being an option. And then the second thing is simplicity. That's what can drive behaviours. And then coming back to my earlier point, if it's not simple, people will just retreat into the do nothing. So I think we need to drive awareness as an industry, but government also need to help that. They're currently, they drive awareness campaigns around a whole host of campaigns, whatever is on their agenda. So we want liquid gas and LPG to become part of that agenda as a viable, and we know we call it a just transition. Just means fair. It's just fair. It's fair to people who cannot afford to go from A to D. I'm not talking about D rating. Instead of A, B, C, or D to A, because some of them just cannot afford to do that. So they need to do it in steps, and they're not baby steps. The first step is an immediate reduction, particularly if they're on heavy fuel oil. If they're on a solid fuel, or indeed an oil, that's a substantial reduction, 33% or so, just to regular LPG. That's not before you even go bio. So that's really, we just need to drive awareness, and the government do need to help out, and just to try and it's not necessarily offering incentives. The incentive's there already. It's a simple solution. It's not that expensive. Yes, I think some help with maybe insulation is already there, but quite often the trigger point for many homes is when their current boiler is struggling. It's either inefficient or it's starting to pack it in, and they get a plumber out or somebody, a fitter, and he'll tweak it and fix it, but it might not. It'll sow the seed that this is in its last year. So I think at that point we need to be able to offer a solution. And like I say, straight away, if they think the only option is a heat pump and a retrofit, they'll just keep calling that plumber to keep my oil boiler going, because I cannot afford this 60 grand option. Well, guess what? There is an option. And most oil boiler maintenance people are also RGI gas boilers. So they are quite often saying, have you considered gas? So there is that point, there is that awareness, but we just need to drive it home.
Finally, Deputy Barry-Cowan, I might just say, so we are talking about just transition here today, and the Climate Action Plan has come out. LGI might argue that it's certainly narrow in its focus in terms of it does promote solar and renewable energy, but what about LPG? So do you see this as being something that the government maybe could get on board with in the short to medium term?
Yes, indeed. It's not just the government. The government must allow and cater for options which are realistic and which can help and assist people, but which are cost efficient. And you asked me, the greatest test from my perspective as a professional politician will be when I go to the doors the next time, the likes of my own constituency, and they will say, I can no longer install a burner. What have you done to help and assist me make the change? And if I can't give those suite of measures that I've alluded to, the first of which was in relation to insulation, the second in relation to the potential to realise what's been offered today, and thirdly, if and when they can afford the full retrofit thereafter, and also have a responsibility to ensure that the state has energy security, has put the suite of measures in relation to the options of alternative power generation options into the grid to ensure we have the grid to meet the demand that will ensue thereafter. But the main test for me as a politician, as a representative, having asked people to participate in the transition, is to offer them options which they can afford rather than an option that only one sector of society can afford.